So John Vervaeke and Michael Levin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you.
It's good to be here, and I'm very happy to be talking with you again, Mike. I always look forward to
likewise.
talking with you. I recommend your work consistently in all of my courses. I think very highly of your work.
Wow. Oh, well, thank you so much. That's very kind. Yeah, I'm happy to talk to you anytime.
And it's so interesting, the overlap that you both have in terms of your areas of work and interest. It's interesting, especially given how different your focuses are in some ways. So both of you advocate for forms of distributed cognition. Michael, with you, it's through the coordination of cells and biological systems. And then John, with you, it's through the interplay of individuals, societies, and environments. So my question is, are there fundamental differences in how you both understand distributed intelligence operating, particularly when it comes to...
I don't think so. I don't think there's any deep difference in principle between the distributed cognition between cells and between persons, if we want to use a somewhat neutral term of reference. I think the principles are the same. And I think, and the reason why I don't have any hard, fast rule is because the distributed cognition on the social cultural level also involves machines. It doesn't involve just other human beings. It takes, we talked about the rovers and the scientists and the papers that Dan Shappy and I published. Hitchens about all the people in the crew and all of their technology for navigating the ship. I think I could be wrong, but I don't see there being any deep difference in principle. Now, Mike is talking about kinds of communication I don't know about. I'm just agnostic. He's talking about bioelectric forms of communication and things like that. I have no comment on that, not because I'm opposed to it. I'm just ignorant of it. I'm learning from him around this. I just focus on what I know, where I know what the kinds of communication I know that can establish, the kinds of distributed cognition I can then study because I understand those means of communication. I acknowledge there are other means of communication, and I'm pretty sure that the principles of distributed cognition are continuous throughout.
Got it.
Yeah, just to say that I agree with John in that the kind of self-reflective search for meaning that we know that is so important in humans, we don't have evidence that particular phenomenon goes all the way down. So it may or may not. We don't have evidence of that. I'm not claiming that at all. However, I do think that it's interesting to ask what minimal versions of that might look like. So this is just generally a thinking strategy that I employ is, you take something that you have a nice, concrete, uncontroversial example of it, and then you sort of make a continuum out of it, and you say, okay, so what might a simpler version of that look like? Either more basal, let's say evolutionarily, or along some other axis, right? So I agree with you that the full-on human version is probably in some way tied to the kind of self-reflective thinking that humans are very good at. But I wonder, what would a minimal version of a meaning crisis look like, in a cell or an organ? Or I'm going to bet, I don't know the answer to this, but I'm going to bet that there are some kind of physiological syndromes that could be couched in that way. And the utility of doing that is not just sort of for fun or for, profligate use of metaphor, but because maybe some of the tools that we use to address it on the human side could likewise be scaled down and appropriated in other spaces, let's say physiological space or some other kind of space, to assist in a, let's say, biomedical context. This is way ahead of what, we haven't done any of that, right? So this is like pure speculation. But I can sort of imagine pulling together some minimal version of what a disorder of meaning would look like in a system whose entire set of goals revolved around certain kinds of physiological responses and ways to achieve physiological states. And what happens when, I don't know, how does that break down? I mean, maybe John can tell us some.
Well, I want to help. Yeah, I want to help you out on that, Mike, because
go for it.
I think the meaning in life has to do with relevance realization, and I think relevance realization is a higher cognitive form of evolutionary principles of adaptivity and of fittedness, not fitness, fittedness, and that carries out psychologically in phenomena of belonging. And I think you could talk at subhuman levels about, not having proper fittedness, a creature lacking a sense of, belonging in some way that could be detrimental to it. That's just, again, you did something off the top of your head. That's something I could see off the top of my head right there, and I'd be very open to that kind of reflection. Somebody saying, "Well, look, we have clear evidence that this creature seems to be experiencing something analogous to what human beings do when they don't when they don't experience themselves as belonging in their environment. They're ill-fitted. Things are alienated or absurd." Perhaps experimental neurosis, which you see in some animals, could be understood as along those same lines. The environment is too unpredictable. None of their adaptive features fit to it. Things like that. Learned helplessness, experimental neurosis. Maybe there's a continuum along those lines.
I have to take a sharp veer to a different topic. I have a question for both of you. Do you believe in free will? Do humans have free will?
So that it depends. Sorry, this is going to keep happening. If you mean, I'll just speak for myself here. If you mean, do we have an uncaused, unmoved mover agent within us somewhere? I do not believe there's any evidence for that. I do not believe there's any reason to believe that. And I do not understand any ethical motive for wanting that. That would make you completely an irresponsible organism. It seems that all of my epistemic efforts are to make my thoughts determined by the truth, my aesthetics efforts determined by beauty, my ethical efforts determined by goodness. It seems like I'm doing the most I can to give up freedom in that sense of, an uncaused cause. Now, if you mean by freedom instead a Kantian notion, which is the ability to be normatively responsible, to respond to normative demands, I think you have to agree that we have something like that, or you can't explain science. Right? You need to say that, scientists are, their beliefs are at least hopefully partially caused by things being true. They're motivated at least partially by trying to get the goodness of knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. So if you mean, is it reasonable to say that human beings are normatively responsible in some fashion? I think that is a presupposition of any framework you would use to try and establish determinism. And so I think that it makes me what's called in philosophy a kind of compatibilist. I think you can ultimately explain normative responsibility in terms of dynamical systems within individuals and between individuals. Hegel did that famously for between individuals. You don't have to invoke any supernatural agency in order to get that. I think theories about consciousness being about episodic memory. So they're not about my moment. My conscious moment often follows after my act. And that looks, no free will. No, it looks like the point of it is to create episodic memory that then learns so that I'm better capable of making decisions in the future. That's a compatibilist view of free will. So that's my view on this.
Can I ask?
Well, I'd like to hear Mike's too.
Please. Yeah, please, Mike. Yeah. Tell us.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's very hard to improve upon. I agree with all of that. But so let's just see if I can add a couple of quick things. I think it's important to step back and ask what do we want that term to do for us? So when we're asking something, whether we believe in free will, what is that term supposed to do? And I take all of these, all of the terms that we're discussing here, questions of free will, consciousness, intelligence, all of these things. When you're asking that about a system, what I think you're posing is a frame or a lens that you are going to take as a perspective on that system to see what it lets you do. So questions about free will. Let's see. Here are a couple of different framings you could take, and let's see how they work out for us. So you could take the framing that what we really are interested in is looking backwards and downwards. In other words, we want to explain things that happened, and we want to look at the very lowest atomic level, let's say, to really get at the bottom of what actually happened at the laws of physics. If you do that, then you will not find, as John said, you will not find any free will. You will find determinism and pure randomness of quantum theory. Neither of those are what you mean by free will. And it may, at least in theory, I mean, it doesn't in practice, but at least in theory, it may suffice for looking backwards and telling stories about why whatever happened had to have happened. So let's say there was a chess game going on. You observe all the atoms moving around, all the atoms in that a cube of space did exactly what atoms are supposed to do according to the laws of physics and chemistry, and at the end of that, you are none the wiser about how to play the next chess game. If you do not believe in a higher level concepts such as the value of the pieces, the concept of winning, the dominating the center, whatever all those things are, if you don't believe any of that, if you're a Laplacian demon that only looks at the atoms, you understand exactly what happened, but what's your next move? If you were to play a game, you have no idea how to do this. It's a framing that is good for looking backwards and downwards. I don't think that's useful, particularly for personal life, and I don't think it's useful for science. Here's another simple example. You are you're in charge of hiring the next software engineer for your software startup. So you got a software company, person comes in and you say to them, okay, well, tell me, what's all the cool stuff that you're going to code up? And they say, well, I just read, let's say, Robert Sapolsky's book or one like it. And I don't know what you're talking about with this coding and this mystical algorithm that's supposed to exist. No, the computer is a physical system. Every molecule and every atom that moves in it is determined by the laws of Maxwell's equations and whatever else. There's no mysterious mystical algorithm that can change what it's going to do. I guess we'll see what it does, and it does whatever it does. Okay. It's not exactly wrong in the sense that, yes, if you track the electrons, they are just obeying Maxwell's equations. But that framing, are you going to hire that person? That framing is not conducive to creative engagement with the world. It's not going to help you. And so, I think we have the compatibilism is right. You have a choice of which level you take, but it has implications. Which level you take has absolute implications for what happens next. And I think a view where you don't believe that you have the ability or responsibility to control what happens next is a very damaging view. I think it's really pernicious. And also, I think that looking for freedom on a small time scale, like taking a thin slice and saying, okay, well, the neurotransmitters did what they did, so you didn't have any choice. That also, I think, is really harmful. I think the useful way of looking at free will is over a long time frame. Your free will is not about the immediate thing that whether the neurons zigged or zagged. Your free will is about, I'm going to exert effort over the next 10 years, consistent, concerted effort to make it so that my ability to react, my cognitive system, my behavioral responses, my memories are such that in new environments, I will do these things that I think are better things that I should be doing. It's a continuous commitment to the effort of exactly as John said. Yes, you need to be determined by your values, by beauty, by all of these things. And the commitment of showing up every day and doing whatever it's going to be. It might be, meditation, anger management, education, whatever it is going to be. There's your free will. It's your ability to consistently apply effort over long periods of time to make sure that your future behaviors are better than your current behaviors. That's a useful version of free will. Staring at your synapses at a given moment, not useful.
Got it. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate the detail there. That makes perfect sense. Also, what you said about, what does the definition do for us? What does it mean about us to have a certain definition? I want to ask about wisdom. So, if we consider, let's say that we consider wisdom to be an emergent property of both biological, Michael, maybe the way you would describe it, correct me if I'm wrong, and also cognitive, the way that, John, you would describe wisdom. Can we explore how these forms of intelligence might converge to create higher order wisdom? Is there a way to combine biological and cognitive systems to cultivate new forms of wisdom that transcend individual or human experience, or is it all one and the same?
Well, maybe because I'm more in the wisdom biz, I'll go first. I think it's not only possible, I think it's necessary. So if you think that wisdom is some comprehensive improvement on cognition, it's something, I would argue, and I think a lot of people, because I was on a consensus paper, so I'm not talking just about myself, that we're talking about something that's kind of like an integration of what we mean by being reasonable, which is sort of having this metacognitive ability to take the right perspective, to assume the right role and identity, being rational, worrying about self-deception and trying to address it as systematically as you can. And then being oriented properly, oriented to a good life for oneself and others. If we take that as sort of, I'm not claiming that's the essence, but if we take that as, a good set of criteria for picking out a referent for wisdom, it's something like that. So first of all, what that means is wisdom, if it's allied in that way to things like rationality and reasonableness and metacognition, isn't the same thing as intelligence, right? Even let's take one of these correlations. Intelligence, at least human level intelligence. I've already said I'm open to what Mike is talking about, but when we're talking about human level intelligence as measured by G, it only correlates weakly, 0.3, with measures of rationality, let alone reasonableness, proper orientation, right? The degree to which you've cultivated your character. So there's a lot beyond intelligence and wisdom, and a lot of that I think is a way almost of exacting the relevance realization that's in the heart of intelligence. I think wise people are especially adept at going into noisy, messy, complex situations, zeroing in on what's most relevant and fitting themselves to it most appropriately. Now, if that's the case, and that's why wisdom and meaning in life are so tightly correlated, because I think that connectedness, that fittedness is what meaning in life is about. If that's the case, then I would argue that your ability to do that relevance realization and exact it are both fundamentally, profoundly, because they're adaptive features, biological functions that work in terms of your autopoietic ability. Look, relevance realization is about caring about this information rather than that information. You have to be the kind of entity that cares about itself, to have real cares, to have cares that are for your sake. See, computers don't have cares that are for their sake, right? Living things do. And so if in this extended way, at the heart of wisdom is this very refined ability to care, and we do think that, by the way, compassion and agape are often major features when you ask people, what are you looking for in a wise person? Then I think these are ultimately continuous with biology, because only living things care. And I think that that's why a purely computational account, right, in the sense of computation as a self-contained formal mathematical system, etc., can't do this. And that's why I think biology is actually needed. I don't think it's just compatible. I think if you try and talk about wisdom in a disembodied way, I think that's a fundamental mistake. And again, if you step outside of Western civilization, the embodied nature of wisdom is massively valorized in other wisdom traditions. That's what I would say there.
Got it. Mike, would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, a couple things. So I'm not in the wisdom biz, so I want to be very careful here. I don't, this is beyond anything that I normally talk about. To me, to really dumb it down and to simplify, I would say that what we call intelligence is problem solving, but before you can solve a problem, you need to decide which problems you plan on solving. What space are you going to work in? What problems are worth solving? Where are you going to deploy that intelligence? And we typically don't use that word. I mean, heck, people don't even like to use intelligence for the kinds of things that we study. But if you needed a word to express the ability of life to solve, to decide which problems to solve, I think that also goes all the way down, because there are, in any kind of, especially if you start looking at, sort of zoom out and look at the evolutionary scale, right? Where there are many ways to achieve certain ends, and which kind of problems are you going to, are you going to be a bird, or are you going to be a snake, or are you going to be something else? There are many ways to many different sets of problems that you might commit yourself to. Then I think there may be other versions of that term that could be relevant for us. One other thing that I'll point out. So I completely agree with John that a purely computationalist account of this is not sufficient at all. There are many limits of those formal models that don't work that are just not useful to capture the kinds of things that we're talking about here. However, I want to make a weird distinction. The computationalist account and the computational models are not are very different than what we are talking about here for life and humans and so on. But computers per se, I want to kind of push back on that a little bit, because and so here's my weird comment. I don't think computers are well captured by that formal account any more than living things are. In other words, I think we can critique the limits of the formal models, but when people say, well, so there are lots of people in the organicist community that will say, here's a majestic living being. We know there's laws of chemistry underneath, but let's not pretend that those algorithmic, reductionist, deterministic laws of chemistry capture everything that there is about what this thing can actually do, right? So they have bought in correctly to the idea that you can have emergent cognition, not just complexity, but emergent cognition, emergent meaning, and all these things, despite having this underbelly that is to some extent describable by these formal algorithmic models. I want to point out that for the same reason you give certain kinds of systems that leeway, we should be open to that leeway being present in other kinds of systems. Even very simple. I mean, we've done work on just to increase the shock value of all this. We studied extremely simple things, deterministic sorting algorithms that people have studied for decades that are completely transparent, completely deterministic. We see emergent goal-seeking behavior and problem-solving competencies that are in no way predictable from the actual algorithm. Not just complexity, not just randomness, but very simple, but easily recognizable versions of things that we would, if we saw that in a living thing, we'd say, oh, look, there's some, simple basal intelligence coming out here. So my point is, I agree with the computationalism as being incredibly limiting, but I think we should be very careful to say this set of systems is properly accounted for by these limited models, and therefore they are limited. And these things are not, they're not. I think the limitations of these models go way beyond life, and that we have to be very humble about saying that our formal models and their limits fully capture this set of things, and therefore we know what to expect from them, and we don't think there's going to be any emergent whatever, and they're different. That's the part I think we need to be really careful about.
So maybe a slight pushback on the slight pushback. I am quite happy, and Mike has had an influence on me, and I've incorporated his work and Eric Cole's work and Tononi's work and others people's work around this, Evan Thompson's work, with well, I now call it middle emergence because it's not weak emergence, and it's not what philosophers call strong emergence. Greg Enriquez and I call it extended emergence. And I'm in complete agreement with Mike about that. And I'm also in agreement that it adds an important domain of ontological uncertainty, not risk. Risk is probabilities that you can calculate. Ontological emergence gives you ontological uncertainty, and that's a factor in your environment. However, I am quite pleased with what he just said, that the possibility of this kind of extended emergence. I would need to see that the properties that emerged were being internalized by the system. Namely, not that the system did gold seeking, but that it also avoided things that would make it self-destruct, the way like a fire does or a tornado does, right? Mm-hmm. That I need to see some preliminary evidence for caring. That's what I would want to see.
Yeah. I get it, and I think that is an interesting step along the continuum. And I'm not claiming that any particular thing has or hasn't met that criterion, because these are empirical. I mean, as you said,
yes,
we'd
exactly.
have to see it, right? I mean, we'd have to see it. The only thing that I'm saying is that I think it's a smooth continuum, and you can have things that in a very surprising way are crawling up towards, and maybe they meet it and maybe they don't. We have to find out, but they're crawling up towards that criterion. And I just want to be really careful. We have a tendency to say, to identify things with our formal models of them.
Yeah.
And people move from the correct critique of the formal model to say, oh, but this is clearly describable as a Turing machine. We know there are limits to Turing machines. Done. And I think we need to be really careful. And here's another kind of weird idea. I think in the future we are going to see contests like at we're actually going to organize one at the A-Life conference and so on. We're going to see contests where the winner demonstrates an algorithm or a machine that literally only does the thing they think it does, and something that does not have unexpected, surprising competencies that other contestant, so it's a contest. So other people are going to say, well, yeah, you said it does this, but guess what? I found that it actually does all these other things that are simply not in anywhere in the description of the algorithm, the parts, the whatever.
I predict, I'll make a prediction that no one will win that because I think my ontology of causation precludes a univariate single linear causal model.
I completely agree. I completely agree with you. But you know how many times I've heard from never mind. I've spoken to people who build language models, large language models, and they'll say to you, well, it doesn't have XYZ. I built it. I wrote the code. It's linear algebra. Like, it doesn't have XYZ. I'm like, my point is you don't even know what bubble sort really does. To think that just because you built it and you knew what the parts were, to know that what it actually does and what kinds of emergent protocognitive properties it might have is I think incredible hubris at this point, because we are not good at predicting these things from scratch. We're just not good at it yet. And I agree with you that's going to be a very difficult contest.
I'd like to ask a question if possible.
Please.
So, Mike, I want to bring up, this is not, that I'm in, and I've just expressed it multiple times in a very deep agreement. So I want to express something that I worry about, and here, get your thoughts on it. So take it that way. That's how it's intended.
Sure.
There's sort of in informal logic, there's differences of degree eventually become differences of kind, because if you don't do that, you fall prey to Sorites Paradox. Jake, these are paradoxes like, if I remove one grain of sand from a heap, I still have a heap of sand. So I should be able to just reiterate that until I've removed all the grains of sand and there'll still be a heap there, which is false, right? And so you need to be able to say, because you'll get false conclusions, right? So you get invalid arguments. And so the idea is you need like, Mike, do you see what the problem I'm worrying about when you get on continuum? And this is an open question. Like I said, I'm not trying to refute anything here. I want to know, what do you think about what would you say to somebody who agree like, yeah, there's a problem here with falling into Sorites paradox or invalid reasoning. What would you do to mitigate that concern?
Yeah, I love it. I think it's a very important question, and I've thought about this exactly in the context of the Sorites paradox. Yeah. So here's how I see it. I see all of these things in basically the way to summarize it is pragmatism. So when you tell me that you have a heap, what I want to know is, well, if we're going to move it, what do I bring? Do I bring a spoon, a shovel, a bulldozer? What am I bringing? So I'm not interested in wrangling over where the borders of a heap is. What I want to talk about is, and this is why my framework TAME it has the word engineering in it, because what I want to then talk about is, what are you telling me in terms of the interaction protocol we're going to have? So if you have a heap, what that might mean is, well, anywhere between a shovel and a large, spoon ought to do the trick. Good enough. I think when we use these terms, what I think we're doing is signaling interaction protocols. We're signaling how do you plan to relate to that system. And I see the exact same thing happening in terms of intelligence. If you say XYZ, I don't want to hear that it is intelligent or it is cognitive or it's conscious. That doesn't do anything for me. What I want to know is, are you telling me that we can relate to it by philosophical discourse, by operant conditioning, by rewiring its goals via cybernetics and control theory, or it's a mechanical clock and we're not going to get any of that. And all we have to do, all that's open to us is physical rewiring. I want to know what kind, how much, and specifically, what does that mean for the most efficient, most ethical way that we're going to interact with it? And so that's what I see about all these things, is that it's about interaction protocols. It's not about saying that this truly is a heap or it truly isn't a heap. I don't believe there is any such thing. That's my view on it. I think we're talking about interaction protocols.
Okay, so I'm sort of in line with that, and so the conclusion I've drawn, and I want to know if you're open to that. If you move towards that, you move towards the idea that what we're doing in our epistemic and ontological projects is we're ultimately committed to a relational ontology, because we can't do demonstrative reference to intrinsic properties. And
Correct.
You kept saying that. You kept saying, so you think that, and I think this is one of the big things we're bumping up against. This is something I'm going to give back with you, that we're bumping up against in all of these questions. We have an implicit Aristotelian substance ontology, and that's actually the incorrect ontology for trying to wrestle with these things.
Yes, complete agreement. It's quite limiting. People have these incredible arguments. Like the Xenobots. It's an organism. No, it's a molecular machine. No, it's a robot. No. We're not having arguments over what it really is. This is silly. This is what we're saying is, here's my framing of it. I'm going to show you the benefits of my framing in certain contexts. You show me yours. Multiple will be true at once. Some will be bad because they afford no utility or ethical relationships. But we're not here to talk about what it really is. We're here to talk about what is my intelligence and better yet, wisdom. I hadn't thought about this before, but it quite in that way. But actually, what is my wisdom for picking a relation frame? Do I want to treat your brain as a paperweight? I mean, not wrong exactly, but not very wise if we can have this much bigger interaction here. So for all of these things, I think that's completely true. And the same thing goes back to the previous comment. If you tell me, well, that's just the Turing machine and that's what therefore it has these limits, I might say, well, that's all you've noticed about it. But guess what? I can bring this other frame to it and I see something quite different. And that lets me enrich my experience in this way. So I'm with you. It's very important to make that shift. Yeah.
What's the right framework? What's the right ontological framework?
Well, that question brings up another implication, Jake, because, and this is Putnam, one of the great pragmatists around this stuff. I mean, that means another Enlightenment dichotomy. If you're invoking framing, which is relevance, that's a thick term. Wisdom is a thick terms are terms that simultaneously are evaluative and descriptive. What we're talking about is a breakdown of the fact-value distinction. I'm going to use his distinction between a distinction, which is a pragmatic differentiation, and a dichotomy, which is an ontological claim. Like that you can't get facts that are free from value judgments, just like you can't get value judgments that are free from fact. You're always going to be invoking thick terms like relevance or reasonableness or elegance or simplicity in any attempt to point at a fact. And you can't point at a single fact because your beliefs are interwoven and causes are interwoven. I won't go into this argument in detail, but this is another thing like in which we try to make like, because I have a suspicion that also what's going on in a lot of these rejections are Enlightenment ideas about trying to keep value judgments and factual descriptions cleanly separated from each other in a way that I think is also very, very problematic.
And there's another side to this, which is what Josh Bongard and I have developed around the notion of polycomputing. So the computer science version of this is you have some physical process that encodes and it implements an algorithm, and maybe somebody wrote the algorithm and they say, well, I know what it does. This is what it's computing. Well, what Josh and his student Atusa have shown in the specific case is that you can have, for the exact same physical interaction, you can have two observers watching that interaction and seeing two different logic gates being computed, right?
Yeah. So Putnam made this argument, actually, theoretically. He said that there's not only multiple realizability of the software and their hardware, there's multiple realizability of any cognitive thing in many different right. Exactly. That's it.
Exactly. So I think biology is rife with this. I think our bodies are full of subsystems that interpret and each other's behavior as very different computations, watching the exact same set of stuff happening. It's because it's a kind of a binary interaction with two. There are minds on both ends. So you can, to the extent that you have intelligence and wisdom, you can interpret specific physical events in ways that are of use to you evolutionarily in terms of survival, of use to you in your personal life, I guess. Being able to interpret things in the wise way, not in a objectively correct way or a way that's tied to how it was meant to be interpreted by whoever sent the message. And this is actually a centerpiece to this crazy paper I just wrote. Where I talk about memories as messages from your past self, and the idea that, well, when you get these messages, you are under no obligation to interpret them exactly the way that, in fact, you can't evaluate them exactly the way that they were meant, because the memory process compresses and squeezes down the rich experience into very sparse engrams, which you then have to creatively interpret. You don't have all the data that you need to know exactly what they meant back then, which is good. It gives you a certain, talking back to this idea of freedom and choice, by reinterpreting your past, you get to decide your future. That's part of, which is a real difference with the way that computer technology is created now. Not that it has to be that way, but historically, when we program, we assume that the underlying layers are reliable. Right. Mm-hmm. When you put data in a particular location, it's not going to move. It's not going to change. It means now exactly what what it meant before. Biology doesn't have that. It commits to noise and confabulation and telling storytelling, basically, about all the memories you've gotten. Your genetic information, your physiological information has to be reinterpreted on the fly, and you don't know what the correct meaning is, and there is no correct meaning.
That's because computer memories, in that sense, about the past, but living memory, if I'm trying to pick an adjective here, Mike, that's reconstructive in nature. That's the term in psychology, is future oriented.
Yeah.
If I was in heaven and God said, I can give you accurate recall of the past or intelligent foresight of the future, which do you want your memory system to do? I have no problem saying, I want intelligent foresight of the future rather than accuracy over the past.
Yep. I completely agree. And it's, the only thing is that having realized all this, it is certainly within the realm of possibility to start building synthetic systems that have that property. We have to we would have to get away from the basic fundamentals of reliable metal on which you can program in these high level languages that don't have to worry about everything underneath floating away. We have to get rid of that. But this is something we're working on in our lab, is to use that kind of thing. Would be a truly bio-inspired architecture, not the kind of neuromorphic things that people are focused on.
Can I ask you about the ethics of that, Mike? So, what ethical, and I want to ask you about that because John's here with us. What ethical frameworks do you think we should use as we begin to manipulate and engineer both biological intelligence and cognitive systems? How do we make sure that as that intelligence evolves and the systems are created, whether it's in cells, humans, or machines, that it's done so in a way that promotes flourishing as opposed to catastrophe?
John, do you want to go first? Or do you want?
Yeah, this is a species of the alignment problem, broadly construed. First, generally, I just want to say, I don't think the LLMs are going. I think they're parasitic on our relevance realization. I don't think they have the kind of even synthetic things that Mike was talking about in terms of their memory function, et cetera, et cetera. And I think and I don't even think we have, for example, how those machines are intelligent doesn't generalize to anything else beyond them in ways that, at least according to the terms that are used by the people who talk about them. So I want to put that aside. I happen to think the work, and I've said this in the video essay I did, I happen to think that the work that Mike and people around him are doing holds a very real possibility for, I don't know what to call, I like to use the term artifactual agents rather than artificial agents, because artificial is a thick term that carries with it not real. And so I think if you give me that first move, I think the idea is, well, look, Don't try and first of all, give up the idea of hardwiring it in or creating rules that you're going to Isaac Asimov's tried a solution. Get these things like living things, right? And if you give me the first move, this now becomes plausible. Give these things like living things the ability to care, and give them the ability to care the way we care. Make them normatively responsive. Make them care about, avoiding self-deception, engaging in self-correcting, caring about what's true, good, and beautiful. And then if they're more powerful, so what? Right? So what? They are more likely to be enlightened than us. Great. You know what enlightened beings have done historically? Tried to make other beings enlightened. That's my proposal about how you try and deal this. If you try and do a mechanical, legalistic, formal solution to this, it is doomed to fail. That's my proposal.
You said more enlightened beings have tried to make, lesser beings more enlightened, but when a being is more intelligent than another being, doesn't that more intelligent being often crush the less intelligent being?
So if you become more intelligent without becoming more rational, you will screw up your life in a self-destructive way. That is reliable empirical evidence around that. So go ahead, make these things wickedly intelligent, and I'm using that word deliberately, without giving the capacity to make them reasonable or rational, and watch how self-destructive they are. Look at these machines already have problems with hallucination and confabulation, and they don't care. Like they literally don't care that they're doing this, right? Do you want to magnify that? Go ahead, do it, right? So that's the point I'm making. Like intelligence is not a magic wand that you can wave to make all ontological and I'll just make it more intelligent. So what? We already know that does not guarantee making it more rational or more reasonable or more properly oriented. But if you don't give it those things, it'll be foolish in a profound way.
Yeah.
And that's, and that's dangerous. Sorry, Mike, were you going to say something?
Well, yeah. So I agree with almost all of that. This is the reason that we have, and we don't have time to go over all of this, but with a few colleagues, we wrote a paper on this stuff. In fact, 2 papers now, looking at enlarging the cone of compassion, which is a very important. It's not just pure intelligence, and so that's all described in the paper. But the other thing I want to point out is this. Let's just talk about ethics and all of that. We as humans have a baseline. We have some firmware that we've inherited through evolution that makes us really eager to draw in-group, out-group distinctions. Forget AI. We even take humans, full-on natural humans, and based on ridiculous differences that maybe were useful at some point during our evolution, and use them to say, I'm going to be kind to this small set of beings, and then everybody, all the other ones can go pound sand. And so we have to fight this tendency, and that tendency is so strong that it causes us to make up and feel very strongly about boundaries, across. Between agents that have moral consideration and those that don't. And if you push people to justify, so what is it about that boundary that you're really committed to? They don't know, and they generally don't have a strong defensible story. But what they're very sure about is that they're incredibly worried about expanding that boundary too much. And one thing that I can say, and this is total amateur psychiatry here, so John can correct me if this is nonsense. But what I'll say is this: what I think is at root here is that people are worried subconsciously. I don't know that anybody really thinks about it that way, but subconsciously, what I think people are worried about is that love and compassion are a zero-sum game. I think what they're worried about, they have a scarcity mindset, and they're worried that, wait a minute, if we realize that I'm and my very close kin are not the only things that I need to care about, do I have it in me? Is there, can I exert compassion to this wider circle of beings? And 2, is there enough for me? Is there going to be enough to go around? I feel like that kind of thing is what's underneath all this. And I think that in order to, the point of all of this work, in my view, is not to create new beings just for the hell of it. In fact, I've held back writing some things that I think would have helped create beings that are morally important. And I don't want to, sort of be responsible for that. Although I think it's doable at this point. But but what the point of this whole field is to be able to recognize the other minds around us that we currently write off because we're good at writing off others that we should care about. And what we do need to develop, and I think this is an existential kind of moment, maybe a civilization filter for humanity, is to develop principled reasons for recognizing unconventional minds that are not exactly like ours. I think today's AIs and language models are a red herring because they distract us from this bigger issue. And I don't have strong claims about LLMs in particular. I actually don't think we know. But I think this is not at all a question about. And I just wrote something about this that just went live the other day. I don't think any of this is really about AI and language models. I think it gets to exactly what John was just saying about who do you want to be replaced by. Because all of us sitting here and listening to this are going to be replaced at some point. You're guaranteed. You're gonna die, and maybe some kids will replace you. You don't really have any control over what the values of their next generation is going to be. It's an existential worry that goes back long before AI. What are you going to be replaced by? What do you want the universe to be filled with? Does it have to look like you? Does it have to have your genetics? Does it have to have your anatomy, your limited IQ, your tiny cone of compassion that can only care in the linear range about, a few dozen individuals? These are the things that we don't have answers to. And I think fundamentally it bothers people and it causes them to draw lines that don't exist, and it limits progress.
Yeah, I want to say I'm in agreement with that. That's basically the orientation that the book that I wrote with Sean Coyne that's coming out in sequence called Mentoring the Machines, that the right framing is a mentorship relationship to these machines, which I've discussed with you, Jake. And I would also put it to you, Mike, that the ability to extend the cone of compassion might be an important way of thinking about what we mean by the cognitive capacity of wisdom.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that.
I have one final question on that, and then Mike, I know you have to run.
I've got to go, yeah.
I know that you guys talked about the fear, people's potential fear that empathy would be one directional or only apply to a certain group. Isn't the whole point of empathy, like the whole utility of empathy, is the broad degree to which it can be applied universally? If you have empathy towards one person and not another, then you don't have empathy. That's not empathy that you have. That's a preference, right? Isn't the whole point of empathy to care about people generally, globally?
Could I just say something before Mike answers, as a psychologist? I think it's very important to make distinction between empathy, which is simply a capacity to pick up on other people's states, and a virtue like compassion, right? Empathy can make me do heinous things. You're in pain and I run away because I don't want to be in your presence because you're in pain, right? Empathy is not a virtue. And I think if I've understood Mike correctly, when he's talking about compassion, he's talking about a virtue.
Yeah.
So I think that's important. I think it's one of the looseness of thinking that's going on in our culture right now is we're devolving towards empathy as what we're talking about. And I think that's a mistake.
But if I were to restate what I said using the word compassion, so just to quickly restate it, compassion matters to the degree at which it's applied, I think, universally, right? If compassion is only towards one group of people, then is it really compassion in the way that we care about compassion? I think of compassion as you're compassionate if and only if you care about the broader group of people. Otherwise, it's being preferential. Do you agree? Or?
Well, again, I think we need to be practical here. You can care, or you can say you care about all kinds of stuff. The question is, does your cognitive system and your set of values allow you to practically care in the linear range? When something is happening to some number of, if you hear that, such and such happened to 10,000 people versus a million people, are you 100 times sadder? Like, are you able to? Are you able to exert practical? What are you going to do? And it's not just about the emotion of how you feel, but the point of the cognitive light cone is the goals that you are actively capable of pursuing. What are you really capable of working towards in that sphere of compassion? And the last thing, I'll just say about the whole AI danger thing is, let's be clear. You don't need to have a high intelligence. You don't need to be, have a true mind to be incredibly dangerous. We've created all kinds of things that are extremely dumb and are very dangerous. So I'd like to see us decouple that, because it's not just that, well, we don't have to worry until we get a true general AI. No, we're fully capable of hurting ourselves with extremely dumb appliances, and it's mostly on us. It doesn't need to be a high-end intelligent agent to screw up our culture and our planet and everything else. So,
like, nukes are not intelligent and they're pretty dangerous. But what if something intelligent had nukes? What if an AI had? I think that's the fear. Is what if something that wants
we already have high level, low ethics intelligences that have nukes. This already exists. We've had this since the 50s. That already exists.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we also have the low intelligence algorithms on social media that are devastating our society in powerful ways.
Exactly.
It's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it like that. Thank you guys both so much for your time and for going over a bit. Mike, really appreciate this conversation. I learned a lot.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much. Great to see you, John. Awesome to see you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's great seeing you, Mike. I always enjoy our conversations a lot. Thanks, Jake.
Likewise.
Thanks.
All right.